Alright, last week I put up a quick posting of a couple slides that I think helps serve as an initial framework for understanding sprint performance. I think if you take this very simplistic yet effective point of view, you have a really good start for how to view sprinting and sprint performance. Simply put, if you just looked at acceleration and max velocity and said, hey, I'm going to do these things for acceleration, these things for max velocity, I think you cover a lot of bases. However, just like many things, it's not quite that simple. So here we are with the initial statement: sprinters are like onions. The Stank? And this is obviously a reference to one of the greatest movies of all time, Shrek. Sprinters are like onions, and they are like ogres. And no, they do not stink. Instead, there is layers to this stuff that I think can make it far more complex. Because if we kind of go to this next slide, right? Well, if it's just max velocity, if it's just acceleration, oh, that's easy. Everybody should be good. Every high schooler should be running 10.9. Every professional should be running, I don't know, 10.2, 10.1, whatever it is, right? However, there are many more layers to this, which really makes coaching interesting and fun, because it's really exploring these different layers, or subphases as I call them, right, to each aspect of sprint performance, right? So if we were to just look at acceleration, for instance, this is a very brief example. Acceleration, right, has its own subphases. Now, how you want to divide up acceleration, it really depends on the practitioner or the expert. Here's an example of how you can view acceleration. You've got the set position, which is displayed in pictures 1 and pictures 1. Then you have the 0 step, which is the initial push out of the blocks, right? And you can see 2 and 2 here. After the 0 step, you've got step 1, which is labeled number 3 here, and that's that first foot contact and pushing off that first foot. And then after that is step 2. After the second step, I think it's helpful to view a framework for sprint performance as steps 3 through 10. And this is simply acceleration, right? So you've got to understand the set position. You've got to understand the 0 step. You've got to understand step 1 and the differences from step 1 to step 2, and the differences from step 2 versus steps 3 through 10. In my opinion, steps 3 through 10 are a little bit more simplistic and very different than, for instance, say step 1. So if we understand all of the things that kind of go into each of these acceleration subphases, we're going to be a much better practitioner. Now, beyond this, this is where it really starts to get complicated. Coaching 101, right? Understanding what we're looking for in each of these subphases, and basically we take an exercise science perspective. I think first and foremost we need to understand biomechanics, and if we look at it from a biomechanics perspective, well, we can look at it from a kinetics and a kinematics perspective, where kinetics is the study of forces. At the end of the day, we need to produce tremendous amount of forces in order to be fast. However, it is not just being able to produce a lot of force, because if that were the case, then simply the strongest people would be the fastest people, and that is far from the truth. Instead, we have to understand the kinematics, which is the study of forms and patterns of movement. And essentially what we're getting at is the application of forces, the very skillful application of forces, right? From this biomechanic perspective, you can break it down even further, right? You can look at the physiology, or you could look at the motor learning aspect, and then from there physiology can be broken down. Well, we could look at strength, we could look at power, we could look at mobility. Maybe there is some mobility restrictions that are limiting people to getting into certain positions, right? From a max velocity perspective, now we're switching to max velocity, maybe someone can't get their knee to the right position because of a lack of hamstring flexibility, right? Now, if we look at it from motor learning, well, we need to understand, are there technical deficiencies? I'll be the first person to say, when I first started coaching sprinting, I thought it was pretty simple, right? You just put people in certain positions, you tell them to sprint. Well, I can tell you right now, right, the motor learning aspect and the motor control aspect of an acceleration phase is incredibly nuanced and complex, and it is very challenging to get that and learn that to a relatively high degree of proficiency and do that repeatedly, right? So there's this beautiful overlay of biomechanics, physiology, and motor learning to every single subphase of sprinting, right? Now that's where it gets complex, and that's where you can see how deep this rabbit hole goes. So I think if we understand kind of, okay, this initial framework, then we understand how deep it can go, then we have to realize, okay, what is the most important area? Where do we get the most bang for our buck? And for me as a coach, that's what I'm constantly trying to explore. Where do I get my most bang for my buck with my athletes? At the end of the day, these are not professional athletes. We're training for, I don't know, hour and a half, usually 2 hours at most per day, right? Where do we get the most bang for our buck to maximize that skillful application of incredibly large forces? And that is where I am going to spend a lot of time myself studying for the next, I don't know, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and kind of just putting out some information via social media.